Well, I don't know if we've lost a lot of people, but we're going to go ahead and get started. We have, I believe, four remaining topics for this afternoon. And we will start this afternoon session with the topic of chronic fatigue syndrome. It is not in your packet. It didn't make it in, and it's not posted, I don't think. So you'll see it on screen, but you will see it posted as soon as our webmaster has gotten it up for us at some point. The topic of chronic fatigue syndrome, as some of you may recall, is not a new topic. It was discussed at the September 2011 and September 2012 meetings. Because of lack of consensus on placement and other issues, we could not move forward with new codes. We couldn't even get to the point of really understanding where the codes needed to be. And then we had, of course, the 4.5-year code set freeze. So this is the first time we've been able to discuss this proposal or the topic and its new revised proposal since the 2012 meeting. And again, for those of you who may not have been here for those discussions, all of the materials are still available on the website. So for this topic, we do have some newer information that will start when you do see it in the second paragraph. The Committee on the Diagnostic Criteria for Myalgic Encephalomyelitis Chronic Fatigue Syndrome and the Board of the Health of Select Populations under IOM published a report in 2015 entitled Beyond Myalgic Encephalomyelitis Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, Redefining an Illness. And it contained the committee's proposed new diagnostic criteria, and it also contains some recommendations that are relevant to our discussion about placement of the terms in the ICD-10 CM. In point number 1 that we make in the background material is that historically the diagnostic criteria for ME have required the presence of specific or different symptoms from those required by diagnostic criteria for CFS. And thus a diagnosis of CFS is not equivalent to a diagnosis of myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME. And so the recommendation, one of the recommendations that came out of that report is that a new code should be created for this disorder, and something that is not linked to the term chronic fatigue or neurasthenia, which was how something was indexed in ICD-10. The committee further recommended that the term be renamed. So instead of ME-CFS, which is an umbrella term, that it would be systemic exertion intolerance disease, and that term again should replace the umbrella term of ME-CFS. And we did have additional input indicating that though the new term SEID was raised by IOM in 2015, the term is actually being used in some clinical practice settings and is being used in medical training. So a term that we just, people are wondering, well, who's using it? But the fact is, it is in use. Now, whether it's in widespread use currently is something that I know stakeholders have raised previously, and of course we'll seek input on that as well. But the issue is it is already being used and therefore needs to have placement somewhere within the classification. And then by way of background, again, the causes or cause of CFS remain unknown. That was mentioned in both the 2011 and 2012 presentations on this topic. And as noted in the 2015 IOM report, the causes still remain unknown, although in many cases it appears that the symptoms may have been triggered by an infection or other prodromal event, such as immunization, anesthetics, physical trauma, exposure to environmental pollutants, etc. So, and some of you will recall, in ICD-9 CM, we did have a unique code for chronic fatigue syndrome. And basically, that code was discussed at the 1997 CNM meeting in December, and a new code became effective October 1 of 1998. And so up until we stopped using ICD-9 CM, there was a unique code. And ICD-10, and again, as you heard earlier in my presentation related to ICD-11, ICD-10 had a code entitled Post-Viral Fatigue Syndrome and indexed chronic fatigue syndrome and myalgic encephalomyelitis to that code. And so the proposals in 2011 and 2012 sought to expand that code, G93.3, to separate each component into a unique code. So now we have a revised proposal, and we have two options. And in the first option, as in the second option, we would retitle G93.3 to not just include post-viral fatigue syndrome, but we would make it post-viral and related fatigue syndrome, and that appears in option 2. Again, to give more information about what is actually subsumed in that category. And then new codes would be created, one for post-viral fatigue syndrome, myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and then other post-viral and related fatigue syndrome. And there would be modifications associated with the proposed new codes to change inclusion terms at the R5382. So before we delve into the actual coding proposals, want to stop to ask if anybody has any clinical questions related to the topic. Again, this was something where we didn't include a lot of clinical background because it has been presented twice before, but knowing that there may be new people and seeing things for the first time, we wanted to give an opportunity to participants to ask questions, but we also hopefully have on the line Dr. Lily Chu, who is head of the group that submitted the new proposal, and I believe she has a statement on the background that she might like to introduce. Moderator, could you open the line for Dr. Chu, who is one of our presenters?
If there are any questions at this time, please do so by using the raise hand feature, and your lines will be unmuted individually.
Okay, moderator, do we have Dr. Chu on the line? Do we have Mary Dimmick on the line?
I'm sorry, can you say the last name, please? We do have Lily Chu on the line. Lily, are you available?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I can start when you want me to.
Dr. Chu, go ahead.
Thanks, Ms. Pickett. Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Dr. Lily Chu. I'm a physician and a medical researcher speaking today as the co-vice president for the International Association for Chronic Fatigue Syndrome and Myalgic Encephalomyelitis. My organization represents hundreds of clinicians and scientists in the U.S. and internationally who have dedicated their careers to solving myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, also known as MECFS. In July of 2017, we submitted a proposal for changes to the existing coding schema for ME/CFS. But this Monday, we received NCH's reply to our proposal. Rather than going through our July 2017 submission, I'm going to focus on responding to the two options offered by NCHS. So just a little background for everyone. ME/CFS is a chronic complex multisystem disease that's associated with neurological, immunological, and energy metabolism impairment. It's not a psychological or psychiatric condition, and it's not malingering, hypochondria, or deconditioning. An estimated 1 to 2.5 million Americans of both sexes and all ages, ethnicities, and backgrounds are affected. It often strikes people during their most productive years, often when they're teenagers or in their early 30s. And because there aren't currently any FDA-approved treatments, the function and the health-related quality of life is really poor. Most people cannot work or attend school, and about a quarter of patients are bedridden or homebound. And it costs the U.S. economy roughly $18 to $24 billion a year. However, despite its high prevalence and severity, up to 90% of patients might not yet be diagnosed, and very few medical schools or medical resources cover this condition at all. Or if they do cover it, it's not very accurate. So as Ms. Pickett alluded to, in 2014, the federal government asked the National Academy of Medicine to look into these matters and come up with new evidence-based diagnostic criteria. And for your information, I was also a member of that committee, so I can answer questions related to that report directly. This new criteria is now being used by all federal agencies. The name Systemic Exertional Intolerance Disease, or SEID, was chosen by the committee to reflect the key symptom, post-exertional malaise. Another reason for the new name was that while the symptoms of SEID overlap with those of ME and CFS, these entities are not equivalent to each other. Consequently, the committee suggested that a new ICD code be developed for SEID. The initial publicity around the National Academy of Medicine report focused on the name SEID, but taking into account the public's views, the government later decided to adopt the term ME/CFS instead to cover all of these entities, ME, CFS, and SEID. From here on, when I use the term ME/CFS, I'm referring to all three entities. The National Academy of Medicine Committee's conclusions included the following 5 points. The first was that ME/CFS is not equivalent to the symptom of chronic fatigue. So post-exertional malaise is the hallmark symptom of these conditions, and unrefreshing sleep, problems thinking, orthostatic intolerance, flu-like symptoms, and muscle and joint pain can also figure prominently. Secondly, neurologic symptoms are an essential feature of ME/CFS, and this is supported by abnormal objective findings. So, for example, we found that neuropsychological testing showed slowed information processing speed. Point number 3, post-infectious onsets are common in ME/CFS, and thus it was included as secondary criteria for SEID. Up to 80% of patients report a post-infectious onset, and prospective studies show about 10% of people affected by certain infections develop ME/CFS several months later. And as Ms. Pickett alluded to, other factors such as immunization and surgery can also precipitate ME/CFS. Point 4, the diagnoses of ME/CFS and SEID are not equivalent to one another, although the symptoms overlap. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, it can be very debilitating, and it frequently limits the activities of patients. So it's not a benign condition, even though the phrase benign myalgic encephalomyelitis has been in ICD coding for the last several years at least. So in summary, we're in favor of the option 2 that was proposed. Option 2 accomplishes much of what we were advocating for, including separation of CFS from chronic fatigue, a new title term, placement of all these terms under the neurologic chapter, the separate subcodes for ME, CFS, and PVFS, and deletion of the word benign from benign myalgic encephalomyelitis. We also endorsed the exclusions that were included in the proposal. Regarding SEID, we concur with NCHS's placement of it in option 2. In our original proposal, we had not made any recommendations because things were still very much in flux. But examining the issues now, we recognize that clinicians are already using all these terms, ME/CFS, SEID, and PVFS. We also suggest having simply the term SEID without the term NOS or unspecified following it. Having SEID as a separate subcode would be helpful for these clinicians and also allow better tracking and research into the relationships among these different but overlapping conditions. We hope that NCHS will heed our suggestions. As you all know, appropriate coding has significant short and long-term consequences. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions or concerns. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Chu. And while Dr. Chu is still on the line, were there any clinical questions or other background information?
Hello?
This is Donna Pickett. I was trying to invite comment from participants as to whether or not they had any additional comments or questions they'd like to raise on the background. And of course, now we can also talk about the coding option. June?
Hi, I'm June Bronner, and this is, I believe, clinical, but with the implications for coding. So just to verify, the SEID is very specific in the disease in and of itself. It's not a broader term for like the post-viral fatigue or the chronic fatigue. Is that what I believe that's what I heard you say. Is that true?
Dr. Chu, were you able to hear the question?
I wasn't able to hear the question.
Okay, June.
Hi, I'm June Bronner. And my question is related to the systemic exertion intolerance disease. That is a disease in and of itself, independent in a way of the post-viral fatigue syndrome or the chronic fatigue. It's not a more umbrella term or generic term for those other conditions, correct?
So what we did as a committee for the National Academy of Medicine was we looked at all the studies, and most of the past studies used the chronic fatigue syndrome criteria. And from that information, along with other studies, clinical experience, and patient accounts, we put together this SEID criteria. So I would say that they overlap with post-viral fatigue syndrome and also with CFS and ME, but we don't know the exact degree to which they overlap. I don't think, however, that you can, they're not entirely overlapped. So you can't say that one is a subgroup of another yet without more research. The post-viral fatigue syndrome term is different in the sense that it usually is given to patients who have not been sick for as long. All the other definitions require you have symptoms for at least 6 months. And secondly, the post-viral fatigue syndrome is a very vague term that has fatigue as a symptom, but doesn't really specify any other symptoms.
Great, thank you.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that helps because I would echo the comment of removing the unspecified out of the G93.30 if they're all seen as independent conditions as well.
Yes.
Thank you, June.
I think
Any other questions from the audience or those participating by phone? Moderator, can you open up the phone lines for the other participants?
If you have any questions or comments at this time, please do so by using the raise hand feature, and your lines will be unmuted individually. At this time, there's no other questions or comments.
Thank you, moderator. Okay, as always, we would love to have your comments to us by November 13. I know some of you may want to go back, particularly those who are at hospitals or outpatient settings, and actually maybe perhaps take a look at your medical records to see what documentation and what terminology you are seeing in the record as you develop your response to this proposal. And I see some nodding heads. Thank you. So unless there are more comments or questions, I think we can begin to move on to our next presentation. And Dr. Chu, thank you so much for being available and on the line with us this afternoon. And I will now turn the podium over to Shannon.
Good afternoon. The next topic is deep vein thrombosis. It's in topic packet 1 on page 27. This topic was originally presented at the September 2017 Coordination and Maintenance meeting. The revised proposal is based on public comments received following the meeting and further discussions with AHRQ. In ICD-10 CM, there are no specific codes to capture thrombophlebitis or thrombosis involving the perineal vein or muscular branch veins. Coders are referred to nonspecific codes for phlebitis and thrombophlebitis of other deep vessels of lower extremities, acute embolism and thrombosis of other specific deep vein of lower extremity, and chronic embolism and thrombosis of other specified deep vein of lower extremity. AHRQ is proposing additional new codes to identify the vein categories. The proposed tabular modifications are at category I-80, phlebitis and thrombophlebitis, code I-80.1, phlebitis and thrombophlebitis of femoral vein, to add 2 new inclusion terms for phlebitis and thrombophlebitis of common femoral vein and for the deep femoral vein. At subcategory I-80.2, phlebitis and thrombophlebitis of other and unspecified deep vessels of lower extremities, code I-80.21, phlebitis and thrombophlebitis of iliac vein, to add 3 new inclusion terms for common iliac vein, phlebitis and thrombophlebitis of external iliac vein, and phlebitis and thrombophlebitis of the internal iliac vein. At I-80.23, phlebitis and thrombophlebitis of tibia vein, to add 2 inclusion terms for phlebitis and thrombophlebitis of anterior tibia vein and the posterior tibia vein. To create a new subcategory, I-80.24, phlebitis and thrombophlebitis of perineal vein, with a new code I-80.241 for the right perineal vein, I-80.242 for left perineal vein, I-80.243 for the bilateral, and .249 for unspecified perineal vein. To create a new subcategory, I-80.25, phlebitis and thrombophlebitis of calf muscular vein, with 3 new inclusion terms for the cilio vein, for the gastrocnemial vein, for the calf muscular vein, with 4 additional new codes to capture the laterality for the muscular vein, with a similar pattern at category I-82, other venous embolism and thrombosis, at code I-82.41 to add 2 inclusion terms under acute embolism and thrombosis of femoral vein, one for the common femoral vein and one for deep femoral vein. We would have this same pattern at code I-82.42 for acute embolism and thrombosis of iliac vein, and at code I-82.44 for the anterior tibia vein and the posterior tibia vein. To create a new subcategory at I-82.45, acute embolism and thrombosis of perineal vein, with a similar pattern of the codes for laterality at the proposed new subcategory I-82.46 for acute embolism and thrombosis of calf muscular vein, right-left, bilateral, and the unspecified under the new subcategory, and a similar pattern at I-82.49, acute embolism and thrombosis of other specified deep vein of lower extremity. At subcategory I-82.5, chronic embolism and thrombosis of deep vein of lower extremity. At code I-82.51 for chronic embolism and thrombosis of the femoral vein, to add 2 new inclusion terms for common femoral vein and deep femoral vein. Similar pattern would follow at code I-82.52 for the chronic embolism and thrombosis of iliac vein. Also at I-82.54 for chronic embolism and thrombosis of tibia vein, with a new subcategory at I-82.55, chronic embolism and thrombosis of perineal vein, with the following new codes: I-82.551 for the right perineal vein, I-82.552 for the left, .553 to capture the chronic embolism and thrombosis of perineal vein bilateral, and .559 to capture the unspecified perineal vein. Similar pattern would also be under new subcategory I-82.56 for chronic embolism and thrombosis of calf muscular vein, with new codes to capture right, left, bilateral, and the unspecified calf muscular vein. So, are there any questions or comments here in the auditorium regarding the revised deep vein thrombosis proposal? Okay, seeing none here in the auditorium. Moderator, can you please open the lines for any comments or questions?
If you have any questions at this time, please do so by using the raise hand feature, and your lines will be unmuted individually.
Okay. Hearing no
At
questions.
this time, there are no questions.
Okay,
sir.
thank you. We can go ahead and close the lines, and we will move to the next topic, which is located in the packet 2, part 2, on page 11. The topic is deep pressure induced tissue damage. Okay. The ICD-10 CM Coordination and Maintenance Committee previously incorporated 2007 NPU AP recommendations related to staging of pressure ulcers. The information generated as a result of this modification into ICD-9 CM and ICD-10 CM has proven to be extremely valuable for surveillance, research, and quality improvement purposes. Pressure injury is now described as localized damage to the skin and/or underlying soft tissue, usually over bony prominence or related to a medical or other device. Deep tissue injury is currently indexed to ulcer, pressure, unstageable by site. AHRQ is requesting the following new codes to identify and track these conditions for surveillance and quality improvement purposes. The proposed tabular modifications are at category L89, pressure ulcer, subcategory L89.0, pressure ulcer of elbow, at code L89.00, pressure ulcer of unspecified elbow, to create a new code, L89.006, pressure-induced deep tissue damage of unspecified elbow. At subcategory L89.01, pressure ulcer of right elbow, to create a similar code, L89.016, for pressure-induced deep tissue damage of right elbow. Same pattern following at L89.02 for the left elbow. At category L89.1, pressure ulcer of back, similar pattern for each of the subcategories, L89.10, L89.11, L89.12, L89.13, L89.14, and L89.15. Also at subcategory L89.2 for pressure ulcer of hip. At subcategory L89.3 for pressure ulcer of buttocks. At subcategory L89.4, pressure ulcer of contiguous site of back, buttocks, and hip. And the same similar pattern at subcategory L89.5 for pressure ulcer of ankle. At subcategory L89.6, pressure ulcer of heel. And at subcategory L89.8 for pressure ulcer of other site. And at subcategory L89.9, pressure ulcer of unspecified site, to create a new code, L89.96, pressure-induced deep tissue damage of unspecified site. Are there any comments or questions here in the auditorium? Dr. Lenzer?
We would just recommend that you take advantage with these new codes and add bilateral with them as well.
Okay. Okay, not seeing any more comments here in the auditorium. Moderator, could you please open the lines for any comments or questions?
If you have any questions at this time, please do so by using the raise hand feature, and your lines will be unmuted individually. At this time, it looks like we have no questions.
Thank you,
So I'll turn it
moderator.
back over to you.
Okay, we'll go ahead, close the lines, and we will move on to the next topic, which is also found in Part 2 on page 25. The topic is pressure ulcer of mucosal membrane by site. This topic was presented originally at the September 2017 Coordination and Maintenance meeting. The revised proposal is based on public comments received following the meeting, as well as further discussions with AHRQ. Currently, there is no indexing for pressure ulcers of sores involving mucosal membranes. AHRQ is requesting new codes to identify mucosal membrane pressure ulcers of specific sites. The proposed tabular modifications at category J34, other and unspecified disorders of nose and nasal sinuses, to create a new subcategory J34.0, abscess, carbuncle of nose, deleting the existing inclusion terms and adding two new codes. 1 for pressure ulcer of nasal mucosal, and a new code J32.02, abscess, furuncle, and carbuncle of nose, with the prior inclusion terms, cellulitis of nose, necrosis of nose, and ulceration of nose. At category J39, other diseases of upper respiratory tract, to create a new subcategory J39.2, other diseases of pharynx. Again, the request here is to delete the existing inclusion terms, create a new code J39.21 for pressure ulcer of pharynx, and a new code other diseases of pharynx at J39.29 with the prior inclusion terms listed as cyst of pharynx and edema of pharynx. At category K06, other disorders of gingiva and edentulous areolar ridge. At code K06.8, to delete the existing inclusion terms, create a new code for pressure ulcer of gingiva and edentulous areolar ridge, and create a separate code K06.89, other specified disorders of gingiva and edentulous areola, with the inclusion terms that were being deleted. At category K12, stomatitis and related lesions, deleting the existing inclusion terms and creating two codes, one specific for pressure ulcer of the mucosa, oral mucosa, and K12.19, which would bring over as inclusion terms the prior inclusion terms would be listed there: the stomitis, NOS, denture stomitis, and ulcerative stomitis, and vesicular stomitis. At category K13, other diseases of lip and oral mucosa, the request again is to delete the current inclusion terms and move them to the proposed new code of K13.09. In addition, a code for the pressure ulcer of lips at K13.01. At category K14, diseases of tongue, delete the current inclusion terms for the abscess and the ulceration of the tongue, and provide two new codes, one specific for pressure ulcer of the tongue and the other for the other colitis, with the abscess and ulceration inclusion terms being moved there. At category K62, other diseases of anus and rectum, same pattern where the current inclusion terms would be listed under the proposed new code K62.69. At category N34, urethritis and urethral syndrome, same pattern, delete the current existing inclusion terms, and they would be moved under the proposed new code N34.29 for other urethritis. Again, also with a new code N34.21 for the pressure ulcer of the urethra. At category N48, other disorders of penis, to create a new subcategory N48.5, ulcer of penis, with two new codes, N48.51 for pressure ulcer and N48.59 for other ulcer of penis. At category N76, other inflammation of vagina and vulva, to create a new subcategory N76.5 for ulceration of vagina, with two new codes for the pressure ulcer and other ulceration of vagina. To also create a new subcategory N76.6 for ulceration of vulva, with two new codes, one code for the pressure ulcer and the second code for N76.69, other ulceration of the vulva. Are there any comments or questions here in the auditorium? Okay. Seeing none, moderator, could you please open the lines for any comments or questions?
If you have any questions at this time, please do so by using the raise hand feature, and your lines will be unmuted individually.
Okay. Does not appear to be any comments or questions on the line. So moderator, if you could please close the lines. And at this time, I'm going to turn the podium back over to Donna Pickett.
Okay, because we had the gift of additional time yesterday at the end of the ICD-10 PCS proposals, where we ended up doing 8 additional proposals that were slated for today, we are actually finished for the day. Just a reminder, not trying to make you sad, but as a reminder, comments. Well, everybody smiled so much when I said the meeting was adjourning. Comments for proposals presented at this meeting are due November 13th, and new proposals for the March meeting is due December 7th. So with that, I thank you all so much for your participation. We will happily await your comments and proposals, and we wish you good travel and safe travel. Stay dry. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone, on the line. Thank you, moderator.